You could once buy a lost civilization by the pound, ground into powder, sold across the counter of a Chinese pharmacy as a cure for fevers. They called it dragon bone. Old fragments of bone and shell, dug out of the fields and sold off cheap to be crushed into medicine. People had been swallowing it for generations, and nobody had the faintest idea what it really was. Then, in 1899, a Sikh scholar named Wang Yirong looked hard at the piece in his hand before it went into the grinder. It was covered in tiny scratches, not cracks from the fire, marks. Deliberate ones. He was holding the oldest Chinese writing anyone had ever found, more than 3,000 years old. And every shard of it had come from one field in central China, where farmers had been digging up the same strange fragments for decades. That field sat directly on top of a vanished imperial capital, a city of kings, swallowed so completely by time that people were grinding up its royal records and drinking them for a headache. And that buried capital is not some strange exception. It is the rule. This is a country that lost entire cities the way you lose a key under the sofa cushion, in plain sight, in the house, the whole time. Not lost to legend, the way Atlantis is. Lost in the dirt, under wheat fields and brick factories and desert sand, and named in the old histories for 3,000 years by people who could no longer point to a single one of them on a map. And one by one they have been dug back out of the ground. Here are 10 of them. We start more than 5,000 years ago, with a city that wasn't supposed to be possible. Most ancient civilizations leave you something to look at. Egypt left pyramids. Rome left mile after mile of cut stone. They built in materials that argued with time, and, for a while, won. China mostly did not. For thousands of years, the standard building material across the heartland was earth. Rammed earth, packed layer by layer into walls, and mud brick dried in the sun. It is cheap and quick to build. It is also mortal. Leave a rammed earth city to the rain for a few centuries, and it melts back into the ground it came from, until a wall is just a low ridge in a wheat field, and a palace is a gentle hill. Nobody thinks twice about. Then there is the land itself. The Yellow River, the cradle of the whole civilization, is also its great eraser. It floods and silts, and every few centuries it jumps its banks and cuts an entirely new path to the sea. Whole districts disappear under meters of yellow mud. To the west, the Taklamakan and Lop deserts do the opposite. They don't drown cities. They mummify them, and whole streets stay sealed under dry sand for 2,000 years. And there was a third problem, a stranger one. China never really lost its memory. It lost its addresses. This is a civilization that has been writing things down continuously for over 3 millennia. The great histories, from Sima Qian's records of the Grand Historian to the Bamboo Annals, name kings and capitals in confident detail. For centuries, scholars knew the names of cities they could no longer point to on a map. The Shang dynasty was real, in the way a character in a novel is real, vividly described, completely unverified. That gap between the city in the text and the city in the dirt is where modern Chinese archaeology was born. For most of the 20th century, and right up to last week, archaeologists have been closing it. They have been matching the names in the old text to the mounds out in the fields, and often finding that the truth is both smaller and stranger than the story. So our rule for this list is simple. Every city here was once a rumor, a poem, a footnote, or a complete blank. And everyone has now been dug out of the earth, measured, dated, and confirmed. These are not myths. These actually existed. We start more than 5,000 years ago, with a city that wasn't supposed to be possible. 1. Liangzhu, the water city that rewrote the calendar. A city with no real streets, canals instead, 6 gates, and every one of them opened onto water, so the whole place had to be entered by boat, a kind of Neolithic Venice on the flat green delta of the Yangtze. This was Liangzhu, near modern Hangzhou, and it is roughly 5,000 years old. The culture thrived from about 3,300 to 2,300 BCE, which means the city was already ancient when the first stones went up in Stonehenge's final form, and roughly the age of the early pharaohs. The part that stops archaeologists cold is the water. Liangzhu had dams, not one, a whole system. Researchers have now traced dozens of dams and levees ringing the city, the earliest, large-scale water control engineering ever found in China, and among the oldest on Earth. Estimates suggest it took on the order of 3,000 people the better part of a decade to build the core of it. A workforce that size does not assemble itself. So, archaeologists draw the inference the dams almost force on you. To move that much earth, someone had to command thousands of people and feed them while they dug. Which means Liangzhu already had real central authority and a ruling class giving orders. All of it generations before bronze reached the region, and long before the old textbooks say China had cities like this at all. And it had jade. The Liangzhu carved nephrite into objects of almost unsettling precision. Flat discs called bai, squared tubes called kong, often etched with a tiny, staring god and beast face so fine you nearly need a lens to see it. In the richest tomb, more than 90% of the grave goods were jade, a ruler buried in greenstone. For decades, this was all just a Neolithic culture. Then, by 2007, archaeologists had confirmed the outer walls of an actual city. And in 2019, UNESCO put Liangzhu on the World Heritage List. That was a formal, global acknowledgement of something that quietly upends the standard story. Chinese civilization wasn't a single seed planted on the Yellow River. It was already blooming, 1,000 kilometers south, while the north was still finding its feet. The next city makes the same point even louder. And it was hiding behind the Great Wall. 2. Shimao. The stone pyramid, mistaken for the Great Wall. For years, people in northern Shaanxi knew there were old stone walls out on the edge of the Ordos Desert. Everyone assumed they were a forgotten stretch of the Great Wall. Why wouldn't they be? Stone ramparts, on the northern frontier, exactly where you would expect the wall to run. They were wrong by about 2,000 years. What was actually buried there is Shimao, the largest known Neolithic settlement in China, built around 2,300 BCE and abandoned near 1,800 BCE. At its heart stands a stepped stone pyramid more than 70 meters tall, roughly half the height of the Great Pyramid at Giza, built at almost the same moment in history by people the textbooks said weren't there. The walls alone consumed something like 125,000 cubic meters of stone. The population may have reached the tens of thousands, supported by satellite towns scattered around it like moons. The detail that gave it away was jade. Looters and locals kept pulling jade blades and discs out of the rubble, and jade does not occur anywhere near Shimao. The nearest source is something like 1,000 miles off. The builders had carried it across half a continent and then done something bizarre with it. They wedged thousands of jade pieces directly into the cracks of their stone walls, as if to arm the city itself with something sacred. And there is a darker detail. At the base of the Great Gate, archaeologists found pits of human skulls, dozens of them, many of young women, set into the foundations. Whether as sacrifice or as a warning to others, the city was built on the dead. Shimao has no writing to explain itself. It sat out on what scholars used to call the periphery of Chinese civilization, quietly bigger and older than the supposed center. Until someone finally looked hard at those great wall stones and realized the wall was the wrong answer to the right question. Travel south and forward in time to a village whose name sits at the center of the loudest argument in Chinese archaeology. 3. Erlitou. The first dynasty, maybe. There is a dynasty at the very root of the Chinese story called the Xia. Every traditional history begins with it. It is the first hereditary dynasty, the one that supposedly comes before everything. And for most of recorded history, there was not a single shovel of physical proof that it ever existed. Then, in 1959, archaeologists started digging at a village called Erlitou, near Luoyang on the Yellow River. What they pulled out of the ground was a genuine first. Erlitou, dated to roughly 1900 to 1500 BCE, gave up the earliest known palace in China. A great rammed earth platform with a courtyard and a hall on a central axis, a layout Chinese palaces would echo for the next 3,000 years. It had the earliest known city road grid, and it produced bronze ritual vessels, cast with the piece mold method that would become the signature of Chinese bronze working, along with a stunning dragon emblem nearly 70 centimeters long, assembled from more than 2,000 tiny turquoise tiles. This was a real state, organized and already powerful. So the temptation was immediate and overwhelming. This is the Xia, the first dynasty, found at last. Chinese institutions increasingly treat it that way. A museum at the site is literally named for the Xia capital, and major exhibitions frame Erlitou as the place where China itself begins. There is a catch, though. We don't actually know. Erlitou produced no writing, nothing that records its own name, let alone the name of a king or a dynasty. Many Western scholars, and some Chinese ones, point out that a pile of magnificent artifacts can prove a state existed, but it cannot prove what that state called itself. Calling Erlitou the Xia is a hypothesis wearing the clothes of a fact. The records don't confirm it, they just make it tempting. That argument is still live today, and it is a good thing to sit with, because the next city solves the same problem completely, and the way it was solved is where this whole video started. 4. Yinxu, the capital that became medicine. Remember the dragon bones from the opening? This is where they came from. After Wang Yirong recognized writing on those bones in 1899, the trail led to a village called Xiaotun, near Anyang. Beneath it lay Yinxu, the last capital of the Shang dynasty, home to 12 kings across roughly 1300 to 1046 BCE. The Shang, like the Xia, had been a thing of texts and doubt. Then the ground gave up the receipts. The bones were oracle bones. Shang kings would put a question to the gods and their ancestors about war, harvest, weather, a coming childbirth, even a toothache, carve it into bone or turtle shell, then heat it until it cracked and read the answer in the fractures. Tens of thousands of these have now been recovered. One single pit, opened in 1936, gave up many thousands at once. They are the oldest substantial body of Chinese writing in existence, and they are dated, first-hand royal records. These bones named names, specific kings, in order. And the list matched the one Sima Qian had written down 1,000 years later, almost exactly. Think about what that means. A historian working around 100 BCE recorded a king list for a dynasty already 1,000 years dead. For 2 millennia, it was treated as half-myth. Then, the kings climbed out of the dirt and confirmed their own names. That is the moment Chinese history stopped being a story you trusted and became a story you could check. And then there was Fu Hao. In 1976, archaeologists found a small tomb that, against all odds at a heavily looted site, had never been robbed. Inside were hundreds of bronzes and jades, and a stack of weapons. And the occupant was a woman, Lady Fu Hao, queen to King Wuding. And, the oracle bones tell us, a general who led armies of thousands into battle. A real woman, named in the record, with a war record 3,000 years deep. A forgotten capital, sold by the spoonful as fever medicine, turned out to hold the keys to an entire dynasty. So hold that image of writing in your mind, because the next city is every bit as old and just as dazzling, and it never left a single written word. 5. Sanxingdui, the bronze civilization, with no name. Around the same centuries that Shang kings were cracking bones at Yinxu, something completely different was happening, 1,000 kilometers to the southwest, on the plain near Chengdu. And when it finally came out of the ground, it looked like it belonged to another planet. In 1986, workers at a brick factory near the village of Sanxingdui broke into 2 pits. In 2019, archaeologists found 6 more. Together, the pits have yielded over 13,000 objects, and they are unlike anything else in the ancient world. Towering bronze masks with eyes that jut out on stalks. Faces, sheathed in gold. A bronze sacred tree, several meters tall, the largest bronze mask ever found at the site, so big its face, eyes, and ears were cast separately and soldered together. Later, Sichuan texts describe a kingdom called Shu in exactly this region, and most scholars connect Sanxingdui to it. The match of place and period is clean, even if the city itself never left an inscription to confirm the name. The central histories had treated Shu as a half-real backwater. It was nothing of the kind. This was a sophisticated Bronze Age culture, dated to around 1200 to 1000 BCE, with bronze working as ambitious as anything the Shang produced, and an artistic vision that owes them almost nothing. The protruding eyes, the gold masks, the giant bronze trees. No one is certain what any of it meant. And this is what makes Sanxingdui maddening. It left no writing, none at all. We have 13,000 of their treasures, and we cannot read a word from them, because there are no words to read. We don't even know what they called their gods, or what they called themselves. We also don't know why the objects are in the pits. Many were deliberately broken and burned before they went into the ground, which at least tells us the burial was a deliberate act and not an accident. From there, it is interpretation. The leading reading is some great ritual sacrifice. Newer work hints at internal conflict, a faction destroyed, a capital abandoned in a hurry. The pits themselves are solid fact. The reason they were filled is guesswork, because the records that might explain it were never written. All we have is the strange, staring evidence. A whole civilization that spoke loudly in bronze and gold, and then, for reasons it never explained, went quiet and went under. From here on, the cities get younger and the written records get fuller, and the ways they vanished get a lot stranger. The next one was destroyed by a legend that turned out to be a lie. 6. Xianyang, the palace that never burned. Everyone who knows Chinese history knows this story. The first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, the man who unified China and built the army of terracotta soldiers, raised the most extravagant palace ever conceived, the Apang Palace. And when his dynasty fell, the rebel warlord Xianyang set it ablaze, and it burned for 3 months, until nothing was left but scorched earth. It is one of the most famous images in all of Chinese history, and it is almost entirely false. Start with the city. Xianyang was the Qin capital, the seat of the man who first made China a single empire. When the dynasty collapsed in 206 BCE, the rebel Liu Bang reached the city first and, calculatingly, spared it. Then Xianyang arrived, executed the surrendered last Qin ruler, and torched the royal palaces. That part is real. Xianyang burned. But the Apang Palace, the legendary one, the very symbol of Qin excess, is a different matter. The first emperor ordered it in 212 BCE, dispatching a colossal labor force toward it and his tomb. 2 years later, he died. The work stalled, then restarted, then stalled again for good as the empire fell apart. And in 2004, archaeologists excavated the site to settle the question. What they found was a foundation, an enormous rammed earth platform with nothing on top of it. There were no Qin roof tiles on it, and no column bases, nothing to show a building had ever stood there. The platform was bare, and the one thing everyone expected most, fire, was the most absent of all. Not a trace of ash or charcoal anywhere in the rammed earth. The Apang Palace wasn't burned to the ground by Xianyang. It was never finished. It barely got off the ground. So where did the 3-month inferno come from? From a poem. A celebrated Tang dynasty writer named Du Mu composed a famous lament about the palace's glory and its destruction, more than 900 years after the Qin fell. He had never seen it. He was writing a moral fable about the price of tyranny, not a report. And it was so beautifully done that, for over a millennium, a civilization remembered a building that was never built and mourned a fire that never burned. The legend buried the truth more thoroughly than any flood. Mud and water buried the cities so far, with the odd legend finishing the job. The next 3 were lost to the desert, and the desert kept everything. 7. Loulan, the kingdom that drank itself dry. Out in the far west, where China dissolves into the deserts of the Tarim Basin, there was once a great lake. The Chinese called it the Puchang Sea. At its largest, it may have covered an area on the scale of one of North America's Great Lakes. On its shore stood the kingdom of Loulan, known to its own people as Kroren. It was the first stop for caravans coming out of the deadliest desert on the Silk Road. Loulan was known in records as far back as the 2nd century BCE. The Han Empire conquered it in 108 BCE for its strategic position and turned it into a garrison and way station. For centuries, it prospered on trade and water. Then, sometime between the end of the Han and the 7th century, it was abandoned, and the lake that fed it withered to a sheet of salt. By the 1970s, Lopner was bone dry, one of the most lifeless places on the planet. The desert that killed it also preserved it. When the Swedish explorer Sven Hedin stumbled onto the ruins in 1900, he found a small walled royal city, a Buddhist stupa, the brick house of a Chinese commander, and homes built of poplar wood, all still standing in the sand after 15 centuries, and nearby, the dead. The Tarim mummies, around 200 bodies preserved by the salt and the dry, some of them 4,000 years old. The most famous, the beauty of Loulan, lay buried under 3 feet of sand with her eyelashes and the fine hairs on her skin still intact. And her features were so strikingly Western-looking that, for the better part of a century, almost everyone assumed she and her people were migrants who had wandered in from somewhere far to the west. Then, in 2021, DNA turned that story inside out. When researchers sequenced the oldest of these mummies, they found no sign of Western migrants at all. Based on the genetics, the reading scholars now favor is that the earliest Tarim people were a local population, genetically isolated, descended from an Ice Age group that had mostly vanished thousands of years earlier. People who simply looked the way they looked, stranger than the old answer, not simpler. They were not visitors who had wandered in. They were locals no one had recognized. The mystery didn't close. It deepened. Why did Loulan die? The arguments haven't settled. Climate shift, a wandering river, the opening of a rival trade route, war, plague. Or, in one modern reading, an early man-made ecological disaster, as expanding settlement and irrigation drained the very water the kingdom stood on. A city that may have, in a sense, consumed itself. Far across the same basin, another desert town tells the opposite kind of story. Where Loulan faded slowly, this one stopped all at once. 8. Nia, the Pompeii of the Silk Road. Some cities die slowly. Nia looks like it left in an afternoon. Buried in the southern edge of the Taklamakan, Nia was the kingdom the Han records called Yinxu, one of the dozens of tiny oasis states strung along the Silk Road. When archaeologists reached it, they found something eerie. Not rubble. Rooms. Wooden house frames still upright. Orchards and fence lines. Furniture. Legal contracts left on shelves. The picture it left behind reads less like a catastrophe than a quiet departure. A town that seems to have been switched off and walked away from, around the 3rd or 4th century CE, then left under the sand for some 1,500 years. It earned an obvious nickname, the Pompeii of the Silk Road, though in this case the killer was not a volcano. It was, most likely, the slow retreat of the water that kept the oasis alive. The documents are the wonder of Nia. Many of them are written in Kharosti rather than Chinese, a script that began near the Indus Valley, in the Buddhist world of Gandhara, more than 1,000 miles to the southwest. A frontier town on China's far western edge was keeping its records in a language from what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan. That single fact is the Silk Road in miniature. This road was never only China's. It was a corridor where Chinese, Indian, Persian, and steppe worlds met and mixed. And then there is the brocade. In 1995, a joint Chinese-Japanese team opened a tomb at Nia and found a silk arm guard wrapped around a body, dyed in 5 colors and woven. Woven, not embroidered with auspicious birds. Beasts, stars, and 8 Chinese characters that read, 5 stars rise in the east, benefiting the Middle Kingdom. It is one of the most celebrated archaeological finds in modern China, so prized it is legally forbidden from leaving the country. A piece of Han-era silk, carrying a message about the heavens, found 2,000 years later on the wrist of someone who died on the edge of the world. Nia was lost to the encroaching sand. The next city beat the desert at its own game, by refusing to be built at all. 9. Jiaohe. The city carved out of the ground. Every other city on this list was built up. Stone stacked on stone, walls tamped up out of wet earth. Jiaohe was built down. And it may be the most beautiful ruin on earth. Near Turpan, 2 rivers split around a steep plateau, leaving a long island of solid earth shaped like a willow leaf. About 1,600 meters long and 300 across, with cliffs dropping 30 meters on every side. Sometime around the 2nd century BCE, the people of the Jushi kingdom looked at that island and did something extraordinary. Instead of building a city on top, they sculpted one out of it. They dug streets down into the rock-hard loess, then dug rooms off the streets, leaving the undug earth standing as walls. Temples, government halls, a great Buddhist monastery, houses, almost none of it was built. It was excavated, carved down out of the living plateau like a sculpture. And because the plateau's cliffs were a natural fortress, Jiaohe never bothered to build city walls at all. The land was the wall. The 3 gates were simply cut into the cliff faces. For centuries, it was a vital Silk Road hub. First, the capital of a local kingdom, then the seat of a powerful Tang dynasty military command, the Yinxu Protectorate, the office that watched over the western trade routes. Then, as the Mongol wars rolled through and the trade routes shifted away, Jiaohe was abandoned in the 14th century. But because it was carved rather than stacked, it didn't collapse. It simply waited. Today, it stands as the largest and best-preserved earthen city ruin in the world. A UNESCO site, and a place where you can still walk down a 2,000-year-old street with the walls of vanished homes rising on either side, every one of them subtracted from the ground, rather than added to it. One city left, and of all of them, it is the one the West has been dreaming about for 200 years, usually without knowing it was real. 10. Xanadu, the pleasure dome that actually existed. Say the word Xanadu, and most people picture nothing in particular, a vague idea of luxury, of a dream you can't quite reach. That meaning comes from a single English poem written in 1816, in which Samuel Taylor Coleridge described a stately pleasure dome decreed by Kublai Khan in a place called Xanadu, supposedly conjured in an opium dream. For 2 centuries, Xanadu has lived in the Western imagination as the very symbol of the unreal. It was a real city. You can stand in its ruins. Xanadu, properly called Shangdu, the upper capital, sat on the grasslands of Inner Mongolia, on the upper Loulan River. It was laid out in 1256 by a Chinese advisor named Liu Bingzhong, following careful geomantic rules, hills to the north and water to the south. In 1260, Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, was proclaimed Great Khan here. For a time, it was the capital of the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Then, as Kublai moved the main capital to what is now Beijing, Xanadu became the summer seat of the Yuan dynasty, the place its Mongol rulers rode out to escape the heat, and remember, they had once been people of the open steppe. And around 1275, a young Venetian named Marco Polo arrived and was dazzled. His descriptions of the splendor of the Khan's court, gold, jade, a palace that gleamed so brightly it could be seen from far off, flowed back into Europe, were retold and embroidered for 500 years, and eventually seeped into the dream that Coleridge set to verse. The line runs unbroken from a real grassland palace to one of the most famous poems in the English language, with one real Italian merchant in between. The empire that built it didn't last. As the Yuan dynasty crumbled in the 14th century, Xanadu was sacked, and after changing hands more than once, finally abandoned by 1430. The grass grew back over the foundations of the palaces and the canal that once watered the Khan's gardens. When UNESCO recognized the site in 2012, what remained were outlines in the earth, the ghost of a grid on the prairie. The word survived perfectly. The city almost didn't. Go back to that Sikh scholar in 1899, turning a bone in the lamplight, working out that the medicine in his hand was the writing of dead kings. That is the part we tend to get backwards about the ancient past. We picture lost cities as a solved problem, dug up and filed away for good. But almost every city on this list was invisible within living memory, sitting in plain ground under fields and brick factories, under the feet of people who walked over kings and never knew it. And the ground is not finished talking. New pits opened at Sanxingdui in 2019. Fresh dams keep surfacing around Liangzhu. Archaeologists are still arguing about whether Erlitou even has a name. Somewhere out there, almost certainly, is a city no one has found yet, named in a text nobody has matched to a place, or named nowhere at all, the way the bronze people of Shu were named nowhere. So pick one. Of everything still buried, a confirmed Xia capital, or whatever it was that silenced Sanxingdui, which would you most want pulled out of the earth in your lifetime, and what do you think it would rewrite? Put your theory in the comments. Some of these were rumors for 3,000 years before the dirt gave them up. The next one might just be waiting for someone to look a little closer. If you want to watch more cities come up out of the ground, this channel is where they surface.